Hello, this is the Ancient Warfare podcast. I'm not Jasper Oorthuis, as Jasper is currently in the United States. I'm Josho. I'm the current editor of Ancient Warfare magazine, and today we will be talking about issue 7.3, Conquerors of Italy, the Early Roman Republic. And joining me today is most of our regular panel, Dahm, Lindsay Powell, and a special guest speaker, a contributor to our issue of tonight also, Mark McCaffery.
Yeah.
We're going to listen now for a moment to Michael Taylor's pre-recorded introduction on this issue to get us all back up to speed.
The unification of the Italian peninsula under a single political authority is rare in history. Italy, like much of the rest of the Mediterranean, is geographically fragmented, cut through by the Apennine mountain range, whose north-south axis severs easy links between the Adriatic and Tyrrhenian coasts. Italy has only been unified twice in human history. The second time was in the 19th century, during the Risorgimento that created the modern Italian state. The first unification occurred under the Roman Republic and will be the topic of today's podcast. In 509 BC, the canonical date for the creation of the Roman Republic, Rome was a modest city-state, with a population of perhaps 30,000. While our sources, in particular Livia, present Rome's rise to Italian dominance as a long progression of victories, a closer reading suggests for the first 150 years of her existence, Rome did little but hold the line against the Etruscans to the north, the Aequi to the east, and the Volsci to the south. Rome's greatest military victory in these early years was laughably small: the conquest and destruction of the city-state of Veii in the early 4th century, a town that was only 12 miles away. Immediately after this puny victory, Rome was sacked by a band of Gauls. No one in the 390s would have predicted that within a little over a century, Rome would be the hegemon of Italy. It was only in the middle of the 4th century that Rome began to enjoy an escalating series of military successes. The reasons are not entirely clear, but one factor must be the settlement of severe internal problems, the so-called struggle of the orders between patricians and plebeians. Legal reform and land distribution created a more robust body of peasants capable of manning Rome's armies. Furthermore, significant military reforms took place, although the exact timing and motives are unclear. Nonetheless, at the start of the 4th century, the primary fighting style of Roman soldiers was that of Greek hoplites. By the early 3rd century, the Romans were fighting as legionaries, with a long ovular shield, a Celtic-style helmet, and organized into 3 lines of maniples. From 338 to 336, the Romans fought and defeated the Latin League, annexing many defeated Latin communities directly into the Roman citizen body. The most intense and decisive struggle came against the Samnites, an Oscan people who lived in the highlands of the southern Apennines. The series of wars, fought between 343 and 290, contained many setbacks for the Romans, including the notorious incident at the Caudine Forks, where a Roman army was trapped in the Narrows and compelled to pass under the yoke, a humiliating ritual of submission. Yet the Romans bounced back from their failures, and more importantly, capitalized on their successes. Critical was an infrastructure of control based around 2 features: roads and colonies. The first major military highway, the Via Appia, connected Rome with Campania. It was started in 312 and eventually extended to the Adriatic port of Brundisium. Military colonies served as garrisons in hostile territory, but also provided land to veterans and increased the military manpower available to the Roman state. In 295, Rome won a great victory at Sentinum over a combined force of Samnites, Etruscans, Umbrians, and Celts. The hard-fought battle was a close thing, but the Roman victory established Rome as the dominant power in Italy. Substantial resistance to Roman hegemony remained, manifested by the support of various Italians, particularly in the south, for invaders such as Pyrrhus and Hannibal. It was not until the Social War of 90 BC that Rome's position as the ruler of Italy would be seriously questioned.
Well, Michael ends with 90 BC, which is a bit problematic, so I would just try to pick it up from there and move through the points that we're going to talk about, and anybody who has anything to say, feel free to jump in, because early Rome is not my speciality, I have to admit. Yes, today we're going to talk about the early Roman Republic, and like the issue itself, our focus will be on the period between roughly 509 and 264 BC, which is the era in which Rome frees itself from the monarchy, founds a republic, and then slowly starts expanding its territory to finally cover the whole of Italy, basically. We end at a crucial point in 264 BC, which is when Rome is on the cusp of venturing overseas to fight against Carthage on the island of Sicily. And one of the interesting aspects, of course, of this early period, of this early Republican period, is the difficulty regarding our sources. We don't have an awful lot of sources. Most of the sources that we do have, as far as texts are concerned, are late. And the archaeology also tends to be a little bit limited. We have great finds of weapons and armor, but not an awful lot to go on, especially not as far as Rome itself is concerned. So perhaps we want to talk about that for a moment, the difficulties with regards to the sources.
Yes, all of the sources seem to come from what, the 2nd and the 1st century BC. So they're what, about 100, 200 years chronologically away from the events.
And there's a lot of revisionism in there as well.
And anachronisms in terms of describing something that existed at the time the author wrote, or something that they thought they were describing might have existed at the time about they were writing, but, sorting those out and getting them into periods of development and things like that are always problematic, especially when it comes to the military organization.
So we're in a sense dealing with a veneer of historical fact overlaid with historical fiction, which makes great reading, but doesn't do forensic analysis much good.
And of course, the armchair historians who.
And there's also the problem with interpreting the evidence.
Well, that being the case, that's what we got to work with. So what do you make of it then? There is archaeology there is some written history of some level or other. What do you make of it?
There's a lot of stylism as well in there. With Livy, for example, Livy likes to do his whole thing about, sticking to a very sharp format all the way through, and it's only, things that take his fancy, really, that he'll break the format for. In addition to that, you've got the dating problem as well. Do you follow Dionysus? Do you follow Livy? Do you go, somewhere in between and, make a bit of a, halfway house sort of thing?
Yeah, there's an interesting remark in Jonas' article on Livy, of course, and the dates in Livy, where he makes the argument that most of the dates that we use are Veronian, and the dates that Livy uses, especially for the 4th century BC, are much more accurate, makes more sense of certain events, such as the invasion or the sack of Rome by the Celts in 387 instead of 390, because you have the Gallic mercenaries in 386, which makes more sense if those two events follow each other more closely than if there's 3-4 years in between. So, but it's a problem, yeah. And you also have the problem where sometimes Livy in particular seems to archaize a little bit more than is perhaps strictly necessary as regards the development of the Roman army, for example, which Polybius and Livy differ a little bit as regards to the early army, and some people believe that Livy adds a sort of archaic veneer to that, by which also the opinions are different.
So as historians then, what do we make of it, and what do we throw away and what do we keep?
I think you can't throw away everything. And on the one hand, you might say that the whole regal period to start with in Roman history is very much legendary, but if we start throwing away that in big chunks, then some of the later references, in terms of some of the origins of, say, priesthood or etc., you start questioning those as well, and you will end up sort of chopping most of it away. You've got to take some of it at, I think, face value to a certain extent, and just tread carefully over it at times.
So can we then just agree that at least that Italy at this time is made up of independent nation states? That's a statement of fact, or is that even invented?
I don't know if I would use nation states as such. You've got different peoples, and you've got them living in villages or towns, or sometimes even cities. Not sure if you can use nation state in that particular, if it's not slightly anachronistic. I think with regards to the sources, just to backtrack a little bit, I think one main problem is that we cannot afford to pick and choose. We have to use everything that we have because there is very little to go on in the first place. And there is no comparative data. There is nothing we can compare things with. If person A writes this about the 6th century BC, we can say, well, it's rubbish, but we have nothing to replace it with, nothing to test it against. So that's the main problem. It's the whole one witness is no witness thing, basically.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is that the Livy is unreliable because he was an armchair historian writing, 400, 500, 600 years after the events he describes. You can use that to dismiss anything he says if you want to. So if any author wants to say that they're using Livy as their major source for this period or this event, this priesthood, this passage of time, you can, by default, reject their arguments simply because they've used Livy. But then at the same time, as you just said, if you don't use Livy, you can't use anything. So I think there has to be a balance, and you have to be able to say, well, that's the only source we've got. What we need to take him with a grain of salt, rather than just reject everything he says as being wrong, anachronistic, a metaphor and archaizing, looking for the golden age. But then there will always be people who are able to attack your arguments based on the fact that you're using a source that they can wholeheartedly regard as unreliable. So I think the problem, you'll never get anything definitive by using Livy and or the other paucity of sources for the period, because there will always be people able to attack. You can make the strongest argument, you can corroborate it with archaeology if you can, and still people will go, yeah, but he used Livy, which is very frustrating, I think.
But is there a value in actually trying to read between the lines of Livy sometimes?
Yes, I read one account which says that every battle account he has falls into a set pattern of here's my battles. I'm writing Battle B now, which of course is incredibly frustrating. But then at the same time you say, okay, well you've got shield walls of hoplites. There's probably only a limited number of ways in which they would come together.
On the other hand, that's the problem with all ancient historians, whether you're talking Tacitus or Appian to some degree. Most of these people were not there anyway, so even when they were there, it sounds like they were never able to deal with the sort of tactical detail that we as military historians would love to have. That just really isn't there. So it's even worse in the case of someone like a Livy.
But isn't it a little bit better in terms of Livy? Because if you deal with Tacitus or if you deal with Appian, then they've got a very much more set ambition in their writing, whereas Livy is trying to do such a big overall scheme that maybe he's able to manipulate things a little bit less than maybe those other writers later on.
I think you have to take it on a case-by-case basis, and that those sweeping statements dismissing Livy especially, and especially at the end of the period where you start to be able to compare Livy with other surviving sources, generally Livy always comes off second best. But that's just incredibly frustrating. And the other thing is when it's tantalising, when you've only got one of the summaries for Livy for the year, and that's essentially the only source that survives. the amazing extrapolations you can get of people making stuff out of, a 50 or 60 Latin word summary of an entire year is amazing.
In the Loeb Classics, they have some volumes where they have Latin fragments. And when I was in Blackpool and Oxford about 2 months ago, I sort of thumbed through the first and second volumes of that. And it's just fascinating. I think they're Simius Polio, one of those stuff. And they truly are fragments. I mean, they literally are pieces of sentences. And you get the sense of the frustration that if only we had one or two other voices that could cast light on some of these events, we'd be so much better informed. We'd know what the weight of opinion was as opposed to what's fabricated.
I did read something recently looking at the topic of Cicero, and one of the fragments you speak of refers to Cicero's consulship, and yet it is pretty much just a sentence, basically, dealing with the Catiline conspiracy. And it is just, it does give a bit of an idea of what we're dealing with the rest of it, and with the realms that Cicero churns out about the Catiline conspiracy, let alone that and Sallust. So,
well, the shame is because I think that the historians before Livy and his ilk in the Augustan age were more chroniclers, so they were going to take things literally by the year. Thunderstorms happened this year, and the chickens cried, but also the Gallic embassy came to Rome and did this, and sacrifices were held. So all of that body of knowledge, which is rather tedious but nevertheless actual as far as it goes, is all lost to us. Apart from those little scratchings we have on stones, it would seem to be, that mark different events, and even those seem to be a little bit obscure in their meaning.
And I mean, the other thing is that whole idea that, one day we'll find more Livy in someone's basement or something somewhere, and then the few times that's happened, like with the discovery of Fronto, destroyed his reputation, because what we found of Fronto was nothing like the literary reputation Fronto had until we discovered Fronto, and then his letters actually destroyed his reputation as the Cicero of his age much later in imperial history.
He had a very good publicist.
He did, but unfortunately then we found what he wrote, yes. But I think that without that whole wait till we find more thing, which is a red herring historically, I think it's amazing how much people can extrapolate out of those single sentences. You get 3 words surviving in some source, and then you get an entire argument, affirming or denying our current picture of things based on a single sentence. And if it was a paragraph or 3 pages of manuscript, amazing, entire careers could be built on those small pieces of information that you would analyze. And it's, I think, one of the joys of our discipline is how much information we can sort of extract out of so little.
And also that there is enough but not enough to not allow different interpretations. So you can debate the issues. This is what we're doing right now, of course.
Personally, for me, it's like if you reject all we have, you're worse off than you started. Whereas if you sift through what's there, and with all of those caveats, still say Livy's all we've got. So something happened, even if it didn't happen in the chronology that Livy gives us. And I think that's one of the other things is the obsession over precise chronology is a very modern historian's desire, whereas sweeping statements of period and regnal years and all of that stuff's far more, and then getting to, we would much rather hear about nitty-gritty details of campaigns rather than thunderstorms and omens, but clearly omens were vital since Livy begins each book with them.
My impression is, having studied the more later periods, the Augustan period particularly, it's the narration, it's the evocation, it's a sort of poetic storytelling. You set mood and you try and create this otherworldliness to some extent. I mean, these other phenomena are there because the gods are involved. So you affirm that with, obviously things were going wrong because there was lightning in the sky and the ants ran away and the frogs were croaking. Obviously there's a problem. And then, of course, you've got humans doing these things, and the question is who's manipulating or whatever's going on. And this explains, I think, partly why it sometimes can be strange to us, but also why we are motivated to look for different things. We're not looking necessarily to be entertained. We're looking for details and precision and granularity. So our vocabulary, our words and our language now allows us to do that, which I think in the case of Latin doesn't allow you to do that.
I think on the other hand, I mean, what you're speaking about our ambitions in terms of understanding Livy. I think Livy's valuable also in terms of us understanding somebody in the Augustan age and what their perception of Roman history is as well. It's what they consider their culture is built upon and how they view themselves. So, I mean, he's writing for his age, and so it gives us a better understanding of his age as such.
Yeah.
Well, it's very interesting. One of the recently articulated theories was, in fact, that what Augustus was trying to do was effectively establish a republic echoing the sort of the second century BC. It was this sort of heroic age of people going and doing great things for country, as opposed to the more recent times where people are doing things for themselves, powerful men using systems themselves. So if you look at it that way, it makes perfect sense. I mean, what effectively Livia is doing these little cameos of, see, these are exemplars of what we would look to as good practice or bad practice, and this is how we've arrived to where we are today.
I mean, can we say then that in the Augustan age, the development of early Roman warfare in the period we're talking about was understood in the way that Livy describes it more than any other author, and they don't seem to have any surviving criticism of that part of Livy? So, you know, the idea that the Augustan understanding of the early Roman military development and early Roman history was the Livian one.
Well, I don't know if their understanding of it is, you know, necessarily the correct one. It's more they're trying to link with the past that they recognise as their own in what's happening in Italy, but they're also trying to link themselves to the rest of the Mediterranean world at the same time. And I think sometimes the line can get blurred there in them representing what truly was their military style back, say, in the 6th century or 7th century.
Maybe this is a good point to discuss some of those military developments and military changes during the period that we are investigating, because, let's say, at the time of the foundation of the Roman Republic, the Romans were fighting basically as hoplites in a mode of warfare that they imported via the Etruscans from the Greeks. And at the end of the period that we're interested in, they fought as legionaries, as early legionaries, of course, with Triarii and Principes and the other ones, in formations, maniples instead of phalanxes, if they indeed did use the phalanx in the early period already. And we don't exactly know when this change occurred.
My suspicion is that these people were farmers one day or tradesmen, and they had to pick up weapons because they had an enemy to fight, and then they went back to their fields like Cincinnatus famously did. And they see a technique which the other side used, which they said, that was pretty damn sharp of them, wasn't it? We should try that next time. So I suspect that what you're seeing is an evolution, and sometimes it can be quite dramatic, and sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't. A good example would be their use of cavalry. I mean, it seems to be, from everything I've read, Roman cavalry, the equites in the original days, basically were naked horsemen riding around with wicked shields and not terribly good spears. And it wasn't until much later, I think almost at the time of Hannibal, they smarten their act and start really professionalizing. And so what you've got is very much an amateur culture. And I would imagine that people discuss things amongst themselves. Hey, this works, but I've got a better idea. Why don't we do that? And presumably because they're in these three groupings, that there are potentially three separate ways of working, and they may not necessarily all work together.
I think in terms of the cavalry that you mentioned, I mean, the change that comes about during Hannibal's time comes about when the Romans encounter the Numidian cavalry from Africa and take on that model, and as well as employing them as allies. I mean, going back to the earlier period in terms of cavalry, I think there's some indication, or some suggestion at least, that some of the Roman cavalry were pretty much the infantry on horseback, being used more as a maybe like a Polish lancers later on in history. The cavalry is there to move around the infantry rather than maybe necessarily doing what we later think of as a cavalry job.
Ironically, they come over as, in a sense, almost like Gallic fighters. Their transportation, they're wheeled on and they jump off and they do the things and they get picked up and they're moved off the battlefield again.
I think one of the things about Rome is, of course, their ability and willingness to assimilate, to notice these other versions of things that are done better than them, and then, well, for lack of a better word, steal them. But the Romans, of course, wouldn't regard it as that. They would, assimilation. Like, in the First Punic War, with the whole kind of like build a Roman navy based on a wreck, and therefore make their own fleet, which they didn't have before expansion outside of Italy. And I think that the other thing we're getting back to earlier about the organisation socially, and this idea of loose tribal groups in Italy, various different population centres that aren't like the polis of Greece. So, the Greek city-states are much more solid in terms of their organisation, in terms of and of course Greece has hoplites throughout, whereas in Italy you've got not polis with villages or cities or less than villages, and then they do have different fighting styles. The various different tribal groups within Italy, even though we call it hoplite warfare, and the idea of men standing in ranks with their shields overlapping will always look like hoplite warfare. But when you look at the arms and armour and the tomb paintings in all the various different tribal groups in Italy, clearly there were some differentiating features of their style of warfare, not just, well, my armour consists of 3 bronze roundels. That there must have been, differences that have been blurred through time, and we now, cover the whole lot in hoplite Italian warfare. And I think that those blurring of the lines, that idea of, well, when does the manipular legion with the 3 lines, when does that occur in comparison? Is it the Camillan reforms, or is it a far more flux kind of situation that, depending on the consul, might have even depended on the organisation? If you think about, again, if you think from an analogy point of view, if you think about the way that warfare was waged in World War One, was completely out of date with the weaponry that they had. Similarly, if you had a consul who was old school, and I'm not going to have any of this modern, what are you doing? That's not how we fight. We fight this way. Your consul's going to tell you, no, we're going to fight in, the good old-fashioned way that I fought 30 years ago. That sort of thing could easily happen for generations before what we regard as the next period of Roman military organisation took hold wholeheartedly.
Did hoplite warfare ever really exist in central Italy in its true sense, like we might see in Greece? Because if you think about just the geography of Italy itself, could you really take out a phalanx in some of that? I mean, moving away from Latium, sort of moving to the edges of Latium, you're really getting into the foothills there, moving around. Say in terms of the warfare between the Samnites and the Volscii, are they really going to be hoplite tactics there, or are they going to be maybe hoplite equipment borrowed, but with their own slant on it?
I think there's 2 ideas here. One is that they would have exposure to the hoplite approach, presumably when they finally got to Sicily, witness our previous podcast where we talked about extensively. But that doesn't come until much later, so your point's well made. So, 500 something, the Italians probably not making contact with Greeks at this point. The other side of it, though, is that much as we tend to think of Italy as having this great big Apennine spine, there are large areas where it's quite flat or just gently undulating. So unless you're fielding vast armies of tens of thousands of troops in hoplite formation, I tend to think of the early battles as numbering hundreds against hundreds. And we were talking in an earlier podcast about the 7 against Thebes. And to some ways, you can actually almost take it literally. There may have been 7 heroes that day, and they did amazing things. So I'm tempted to think that if you're looking at Rome as a small city-state of maybe just a few thousand people, its army isn't terribly big. And it's going to go off to war, possibly against a neighbour. Later on, it's going to bring on its allies who join with them with their different fighting styles, and presumably they have to come to some kind of strategic compromise because they've got to engage the enemy somehow. And this is what I'm thinking. So I think the scale is different. You can have phalangite battles because they're smaller numbers to start with.
But I think it's the opposite problem. In Greece, you've got, the dancing floor of war. There are, in fact, for this culture that's invented hoplite warfare, it is the most inappropriate country for we need flat land so that we can stand there and fight in shield walls. Greece is, there's Mantinea and there's a couple of other places that are ideal, and of course they get reused again and again and again. Whereas Italy has vast tracts of land, much wider, flatter, so much more appropriate for that style of warfare. But again, if you've only got 300 troops fighting 300 troops, you can do it almost anywhere. But in a way, Italy's more suited to hoplite tactics than Greece was.
There's one point, if I may, that is the problem with the nature of Greek warfare, of course. The idea that the Greeks fought in hoplite formation is also something that is constantly debated, especially the date and the style and the nature of hoplite warfare as such. And whether or not it's peculiar to Greece, of course, because you said that hoplite warfare was invented by the Greeks, but what it basically is just men with shields and spears operating in close formation. And you have that in Egypt in the Bronze Age, you have that in China, it doesn't really matter. So that's something that I think, if you simply look, it's a matter of scale at some point. If you have a large army with thousands of men, how do you organize those men as efficiently as possible? And then you have to use some sort of formation usually. Yeah. And it sort of goes hand in hand with state formation as such. So when you look at Rome as an early city-state, I think there is reason to doubt, or at least expect it to be more, let's say, aristocratic or heroic. How do you want to call it? Something less organized than what you would expect in something that is truly a complete and well-organized state, as it would later become, of course. And I think maybe the change from hoplite warfare, or however you interpret it, maybe in this case more as kind of heroic warfare, to the manipular army has something to do with developments of the state, with a more central organization and that sort of stuff.
And its class differences too. I think as the state becomes bigger and richer over time, the differences between the aristocrats, the patricians, and the plebeians become much more pronounced. I mean, it was supposedly, if you look at the story of the kings and so on, it's already quite pronounced then. But I think as you build the numbers, the disparity in wealth and the assets between those people, what a patrician and an equitist can field, are vastly different.
I like the idea that in early Roman history you've got the Fabii actually deciding to take out their own army, that made up of their own family. I mean, I think that's the epitome of this small army going out, and we're probably grandizing something that's really not really an army, but rather a band, really, of men going out.
But the interesting thing is, if you're, for example, an Augustan historian like Livia, that doesn't really sound terribly heroic unless you dress it up.
Yeah.
There was a gang with clubs and spears and things, and they beat up the local enemy. Well, that doesn't sound too bad.
I think the idea of a private army is very problematic because there are examples, but it's like, well, that doesn't fit now of our idea of what Roman warfare was at any period. That's it's not till much later, and you get the civil wars where your legions become your private army. The idea that you could use your family, relatives, presumably any farmers who were beholden to you, your amici and all that sort of thing, as your own private forces. There's no place for it in Roman warfare in the sort of traditional sense of how it developed.
To one extent, I think there is, because in terms of what was going on socially at the time, that there's so much upheaval that the idea of one family sort of going out and saying, we're going to make a point here, isn't that far astray from the plebs getting up and saying, we're going to sit on a hill outside town until you do a deal with us.
But at the same time, if you mustered a bigger army, that's what's happening in that bigger army anyway. Like you're going to have the Fabii and the other big families in the same shield wall, and presumably fighting side by side. I don't think that they would have been mixed up and stand next to strangers. So that in a sense, your larger army is simply that expanded into 6 families worth of troops, so to speak. So it is what's happening, but it doesn't fit our image of Roman warfare. This idea of the idealized Roman farmer who fights for the state, as opposed to these other alliances that are probably more important in the Roman farmer's life, is his immediate allegiances to a particular family or a particular group, rather than his allegiance to Rome the state, whereas the later view of Rome the state is, no, Rome the state was your first allegiance.
It also sort of fits with the Roman patron-client system, I guess. Which is basically a leader and follower structure already. So it's an easy step for a leader who has a number of clients to then say, you know what, I'm also going to use you militarily. And then you have these sorts of pyramidal structures, and you can mobilize a fairly sizable armed force that way. I think that would fit also in this for this period, for the early period at least.
The Roman army at this period is basically Roman society at war. So in all of its myriad and different odd constructions, and its tribes and its family connections, and as you said, the patron-client type arrangement, and it would probably be very hard to classify in a modern term, because we don't have that type of thing. We've organized things very much along rank and file. They probably wouldn't be quite so rigid.
But is this the model that we should think of as the norm across Italy at the time, or should we be thinking that this is Rome individually? Because I sort of get the idea that even though all the historical sources sort of focus on Rome and sort of just give us sort of tantalizing glimpses at, maybe what's going on elsewhere, I mean, sometimes you get the feeling that Rome is just one of many, and it's just it's pure luck that in the end that Rome does come out of the fight on top.
I think that they are one of many, and it's not clear at all, in the dates we're looking at, that they will ultimately become top dog. And it's not even clear, even in the first century BC, that's totally assured. I mean, they almost lose it during the social war as well. So the challenges, for example, I think our best other alternative source would be the Etruscans, because we've got paintings and we've got Etruscan language we can't understand. But we have a viable, well-sophisticated society which clearly has power and reach across Italy.
Not just Italy for the Etruscans. I mean, there's mention in terms of histories of Alexander that amongst the envoys coming to greet him in Babylon is an envoy from the Etruscans seeking friendship.
Yeah, we also know that they joined forces, of course, with the Carthaginians to oust the Phocians on Corsica and things like that. They were vying for control of the Mediterranean Sea for certain with the Greeks and the Carthaginians. So yeah, the Etruscans were a force to be reckoned with, of course.
And I think, in that regard, I think one of the things that marks Rome out is their perseverance. The Roman attitude is, if we beat you, you're beaten. But Rome never shows that attitude itself. It's, if we get beaten, we get the chance to come back and try again, and we will. So I think the dogged nature of Roman warfare, they lose wars, catastrophically. The Claudine Forks and things like that, the sack of Rome in 390 or 387, they still rebound from that. There's still a willingness to put their armies in the field and try again, as opposed to bow to modern events and go, yeah, we got beaten, we need to not do anything. And I think that's one of the things that sort of marks out Rome's attitude to warfare.
Yeah, I think so too. The resilience is remarkable. I mean, if you look at Alexander the Great, for example, it's victory after victory, and you sort of get the impression that even at the moments where he's met with fierce resistance, like at Tyre, he always wins in the end anyway. Whereas with the Romans, of course, you have them being beaten to a pulp, sent home in shame, and then later they come back and emerge as victors. So I guess that's part of the appeal of studying Rome also. It's very human protagonists, as it were.
Yeah, that's very well said, and I think that interesting aspect of the character, again, it comes over in Livia and the Augustan. Sort of, it's a virtue. It's this virtus, that shows this. You laugh in the face of an overwhelming odds, and I suppose there's a religious element to this, as we covered in other issues of the magazine, where they had a fervent belief in the sort of that the gods were on their side. and that was its own reward, I suppose, as well. But it's a fascinating character trait, isn't it? That these people could not be defeated in a sense by losing a battle. They would lose 10 battles and still come back.
Yeah, it's a kind of mix of manifest destiny and sheer pigheadedness, I guess, in the face of of whatever odds they're opposed against. So, yeah.
But I think, I mean, from a military perspective, when they do get their, roundly beaten, do they go back and ask those questions? Is it a corporation? What did we do wrong? What do we do better next time? What techniques can we steal from them and adapt and adopt? And is that the way they're talking, or is it let's just try the same things again, and we'll appease the gods more, and we won't use you as a commander? I think it's very tricky because I think all of these enemies had different styles of fighting that's been lost, and one of the reasons for that is when you look at the beginnings of gladiatorial combat, there's styles of fighting in the Samnite gladiator that aren't reflected in the other gladiatorial styles, almost as a way of that there was a differentiation between the way the Samnite fought and the way the Etruscan fought, the Oscan and anyone else, that we've lost because we simply use the term hoplite. But we know archaeologically they had different arms and armour, so they must have had different styles of fighting that required, flexible thinking. And I think that the later the Romans show that ability to adapt and adopt other people's technologies for their own purposes. Do those developments come out of adversity?
It probably comes out of the network they seem to build over periods of hundreds of years, which is through these treaties. And it's partly covered in the article about fetiales, that you break the treaty, that there's a legalistic basis on the reason why we have wars in the way we do. Without regurgitating the article, I mean, it's this kind of litigious approach. For example, you send the guy out, having got the permission of the people in the Senate and the assemblies to go off and say that you've broken, and you literally you call out from city walls and say, you've got to come out and deal with this because you've broken our treaty, and if you don't fix it, then we are within our rights to declare war. And eventually they throw a symbolic spear over the wall, and that's the act of declaring war. And I'm going to imagine that by building these alliances across the nation, you can call upon these people under the law, under the treaty, to deal with a third enemy, of course. So naturally you build into your army diversity. And of course, as you build this across the heel of Italy and up the spine of the Apennines, you can feel the formidable and very diversified army.
I think that on the one hand, the fetiales, it shows that there is a set of rules, but it shows that there is a set of rules in central Italy, because when Rome starts to break out of warfare just with its, if you like, its closest neighbours, it then starts to have to adapt to a whole new set of rules, and that's where the fetiales start to disappear from Roman culture, because they're no longer useful. They can no longer send something that somebody's going to recognise further afield and actually respect that process anymore.
But interestingly, though, the act of war which involves going to the Temple of Bellona and sticking a spear in the ground there was evoked and reinvented by Augustus.
Yeah.
Because he needed something that was symbolic and echoed this ancient tradition, and he legitimizes his regime by saying, I'm not doing anything that's not done by our forefathers, and of course they knew all the right things to do, and I'm just the guy copying what our ancestors did, most maiorum and all the rest of it. So I think it's very interesting. It's an insight into the way the Romans very early become a society based on rules, and of course you have to bend to their rules, and it's all written down and it's put on temple walls. Everybody can see it. There's no grey in any of this. And of course, what's interesting over time is how the equites gradually become the sort of lawyer society. I mean, they're the people who provide a lot of the expertise into court life and so on. And I wonder whether, in fact, that gave them an advantage over their enemies, because they were able to leverage that aspect of this whole thing, whereas other people weren't. I was quite struck when I wrote one of the pieces. I think again it was in the context of religion that this whole thing is an elaborate charade in a sense. I mean, what they're trying to do is, in a way like the United Nations does today, It tries to avoid open conflict by getting people to the table. Look, you broke a treaty contract agreement with us. We can fix this, but there are consequences if you don't. And they give you like 3 goes. And if after the 3rd attempt you don't agree, then you get the full, sharp end of the spear. So it's quite clever. I mean, I think the first response of Rome is actually, let's see if we can negotiate, civilize people, and then if you have to go to war, that's definitely a last resort. And I don't think that was true of all societies. I think war was something that they turned to quite quickly.
I might be sceptical here, but I think at the same time the Fetiales are used just as much for Rome's military benefit in terms of saying, right, we're going to go through this whole process now, but just in case it works out how we think it's going to work out, let's get the army ready. And by the time that we've gone through the 30 days period of going back 3 times and asking nicely, we'll be ready. Doesn't matter if they're not ready. And we can trot the army out after we've done the whole go out to the border and throw.
Well, that's why they're able to leverage it. I mean, in a sense, a certain country on the other side of Europe is using this right at this moment. They're using this sort of legalistic framework to buy time and tying the West up in knots in treaty negotiations while using all of that time to do all of these surprise maneuvers on the ground. So yes, it's militarily quite effective. And
at the same time, it's propaganda on their own population. I mean, the Roman people are being fed this, we as the Senate have sent out our representatives, this priesthood of 20 men who are all, of course, senators, given the position for life, and they have gone out, they've asked nicely all these times. It's no good that the tribunes keep saying, oh, we can't go to war because we'd like to talk about voting rights. We'd like to go to war, and we've done it nicely, and the gods are now expecting that we're going to bring justice home. So we'd better go out, and you can talk about your voting rights when we get back.
And also the lack of, the drawing a circle around the person, and all of the wonderful epic moments of rhetoric that you get at Livy. That essentially their negotiating style that Rome as a negotiator really doesn't give up much. It puts restrictions on other people's movement and other people's sphere of influence, but never on their own. It's like the board game of diplomacy or risk, where I won't attack you in Kamchatka, but I didn't say anything else about anywhere else on the board. The Romans perpetually do that. You're not allowed to cross this river. Didn't say anything about us.
There's a couple of nice occasions as well where the response that the Romans get is, of course, doesn't play by the rules. There's one, I think, who is it? Gracchus, who was a leader of the, Samnites, I think it is, at one stage, whose response is, I'm not interested, go talk to the tree.
Well, just to talk about the archaeology very briefly and to see how it supports what we've talked about so far. If you look at the introduction of the rectangular shield, for example, which has been argued the Romans adopted from, I think it was the Samnites, which sort of showcases the whole flexible attitude that the Romans had towards their military and the military machine in general. And such a flexibility is undoubtedly also to be noted as far as their tactics and perhaps also the military organization is concerned.
My impression on that note, I think it highlights 2 things. First, we don't know how much of what we got is representative of the total, because we only have a small sample to begin with. And that's
always the problem, of course.
Yeah, it is. And the second thing is a lot of it does show Gallic influence, and I'm always very impressed by the quality of Gallic armor anyway. And it's consistently the Gallic people, which I mean the people from basically Transalpine Gaul all the way up across as far as the Rhine River and the Danube, that just seem to be metal workers par excellence. And I think the Italian nations, I call them nations, recognize that.
There's a lot of interplay between the peoples of Italy and the peoples from elsewhere, and there's a lot of. I think it's always good to remember the variety of the cultures in Italy itself, because Italy is a big country. It's something that perhaps isn't always obvious when you look at the map and you see this slender peninsula, but it's quite a big country. It takes a while to get from one end to the other. and to travel north and south. And there are loads of people living there, some of whom we only know vaguely, of course. And they all influence each other, and also influence, of course, people from outside the Italian sphere. There's a lot of interplay between Etruscans and native Italian peoples and the Celts further to the north and across the Alps, and where they have these ideas that flow from one end to the other, rectangular shields from central Italy, the helmets from the north, from beyond the Alps, also the chainmail, of course, which is also probably a Celtic invention originally, and that's something that, as was mentioned towards the beginning of the podcast, is something that's generally glossed over because of how removed we are in time from this period itself. Everything is sort of smoothed over and made more homogeneous.
I think that's something interesting. When I was doing research about Drusus the Elder, the thing that surprised me was the fact that Rhaetia, the area of Rhaetia, and the Venetic area of northern Italy, that we think of as northern Italy, was not thought of as northern Italy. It was a separate country. And it took Drusus to basically conquer it, and that strip going up the central piece of the Alps to really bring that part into Italy. So there was already, right in the foothills of the south side of the Alps, if you like, the enemy at the doorstep. And if you read the Cassius Dios and these sorts of things, you get a distinct impression that these people were the ancient equivalent of terrorists. I mean, they were bandits, the latrones, who were picking on Italian traders, trying to go about their business, as honest citizens do. And one of the justifications, of course, that Augustus came up with, we had to deal with the menace. So even as late as the very, very last days of the first century BC, there are foreigners on the doorstep.
But at the same time, you've also got Livia, who's basically one of them, isn't he? I mean, he's from up that way. How much is his account of Roman history, affecting how we actually view up there? Should we take him as, unfortunately, I'm going back to the sources again, but is he biased towards that northern group who we start out calling Gauls, or what we call today northern Italy? Is he saying good things? Is he saying bad things about them?
Is there any? Must be some work on regional bias in Livy.
He's accused at one stage of his Patavianness being obvious in some of his writing, but that criticism sort of comes from Augustan or close to the Augustan age itself.
I mean, how often does that region feature in what survives? Maybe we don't know because it doesn't get to us. I mean, the only parallels really sort of Cicero and Arpinum, and the idea that he's very biased towards Marius because Marius was also from Arpinum. Yeah, I mean that again, Romanness and being from Rome is the wider view, but the more smaller view is, of course, that there are still regional and smaller allegiances and loyalties at work much later throughout Roman history. So again, your identification that you came from a particular town or a particular region lasts right through until contemporary Italian society, but certainly throughout the Roman period, there are those things occurring, that there are loyalties at play that are not to the state of Rome, which is the view we get in the sources. That's the view they're trying to paint. But I think that there's enough anecdotal evidence to show us that yes, but then at the same time, these people are loyal to other things too. Whether it be patron-client, whether it be amici, whether it be a regional bias.
I think that's a good point to sort of leave it off here as far as the discussion of the issue is concerned, and time to turn our attention towards answering perhaps some questions that listeners have sent in. If you're listening to this, we're always keen to receive your questions and to try and answer them. I have here from the Facebook page Kenny Robertson. I've been waiting for this. Glad to hear you guys are recording one. I'm wondering what, if any, government practices carried over from the days of the kings into the Republic, or how the transition of government affected the existing social classes.
Well, I think the obvious one is the Senate. That was the group of Senex, the old men, the council advisors of the king. And that was probably the biggest thing to carry on. And I guess the rest of Roman history is how the common folk, the plebeians, try to secure their rights in the face of these people. That would be the obvious answer.
It also comes down to whether you actually think the consuls are established during the time of the kings, or whether that's something that is immediately in the first years of the Republic. It might be. I think I've read a couple of interpretations saying that the consuls are originally something put in during the last period of the regal period in order to be used as yes men, really.
As opposed to the idea that there are checks and balances on one-man rule, which is the traditional view that the two consuls was designed to not have the problem of a king, which from a Roman attitude point of view, goes all the way down to Julius Caesar. That the idea of using the word rex is the big boogeyman of Roman politics. And one of the amazing things about Augustus is he essentially sets himself up as that, but does it in a way where, as Lindsay was saying, I'm just doing what our ancestors did. So every part of empire is set up with these amazing early republican antecedents, and yet we get one-man rule justified in the most republican of ways, not justified in terms of this was the way that Romulus ruled us. And there's the story that Augustus thought about adopting the name Romulus, but the version of events in Livy that he was torn apart by a mob was one of the precedents he didn't want to set.
That's one of the interesting things about the Roman Empire, is that throughout the Principate, so for the first 2 centuries, it is presented as a republic still. They talk about the Republic of Rome, and it's not until you get the dominate in the 3rd century AD that it changes, and it's clear that the emperor is, what it already was, of course, for quite some time, this absolute monarch, this dominus, this master ruling over a nation of slaves, basically.
If you look at the coins still call out re publicae. They still harken back to this idea of commonwealth. Things. And I think that's central to the whole understanding here, is that it's still portrayed as being a participative democracy at some level. I mean, they still have, in the towns throughout the empire, they still have elections and this sort of thing. So it may well be that, yes, that there is this nominal head of the organization, but I think on a day-to-day basis there's still some participation in the res publica.
Yeah, the emperor is sort of shown as this guardian of the republic and republican values. I think it changes slightly to when you go into the late empire, but it's the basic idea is there. Yeah, sure.
Yep. To go back to the question, I think there's another job that hangs open. I think that's the job of the praetor. The praetor, I think, came before the consuls. I think.
There is a suggestion of that. There's a suggestion at some stage that there were two praetors, so that again leads to questioning where in our sources is there confusion happening between 2 praetors or 2 consuls, and then separating exactly what the early jobs of those positions were, whatever they were called as such in their first instance.
And I mean, the other thing in the regnal period was that there must have been magistracies. There can't have just been the kings and the senate. There must have been, and there's no reason, and I'm not up on that, but the aediles and the quaestors and the praetors must have existed under the regnal period.
Yeah, the quaestor originally was some sort of police detective, as far as I understood. I'm not sure if that was already the case during the kings, where if there was a homicide, the quaestor would be literally the one to ask questions in order to figure out who did that. I've always had the idea that would make a great TV show or something, but that's a topic for another discussion.
Roman bones, no.
Exactly. So I think we've sort of covered this question. Now let's turn to Carlos Panigua Macias, and if I'm garbling the name, I do apologize. A fan from Mexico who wonders how it was possible that Roman senators who served as generals of legions made such good commanders like Scipio, Julius Caesar, Pompey. more or less noblemen in general, why it was that they were so effective in as military commanders. I think the answer is obvious in that they were the only ones liable to become commanders in the first place, but maybe somebody else wants to.
Yeah, I think also, of course, there were lots of bad commanders, and like when you look at the Punic Wars, the first battles against Hannibal, you get a whole series of disastrous Roman commanders who essentially die on the job, and the good commanders are the ones who come out of that and come out on top. The second century crisis, for instance, where you have an entire century of bad command decisions by Romans. And I think the other thing is that, the idea that and it may be anachronistic, the idea that the centurions are your backbone, they are the professionals who don't change. This, 1 year consul comes in and he won't do anything radically different than Roman tactics anyway, and that the Roman army is so fearsome that it will prevail in the end, regardless of who's in command. And then propaganda, that, the reason we're told about how amazing Julius Caesar is as a commander, because he tells us himself. And these other, commanders, Scipio Africanus, for instance, who's he was the right man at the right time, but there's literally a process of elimination to get to him before they learn their lessons of how to defeat Hannibal. And there are others who are much more tantalizing. Marius, for instance, who's consul 7 times and defeats the greatest threat to Rome since the Gallic invasion of 390 or 387. But every source we know of is hostile to him because of his fall from grace. We know that we know that Sulla writes a source. We know that all of the patrician sources are anti-Marius because he was a novus homo. So that his achievement is blackened and lessened by the sources not wanting to give him credit. And there may be others. Fabius the Delayer was a criticism, not a compliment. So I think, again, hindsight helps decide who were the great Roman generals at the time as well.
I would agree, definitely, in terms of the structure in the Roman army. I mean, you've got the legates, you've got the optios, you've got the centurions, all sort of vying to sort of build up, climb up the ladder there, and also they're regularly. They're there for a long term, and they add the stability. But at the same time, there's also the structure of how in Roman politics the younger senators are sort of. They're trained, taken under the tutelage. For example, if you're going to Cicero, for an example, albeit not in the military sense, but in terms of his legal training, he's being put under senior senators, but it basically shadowing them in their day-to-day work, and then junior senators being, when they reach, say, the quaestorship, or even before that, being paired with a general going out and actually learning on the job. Has to have a big influence upon the guys who eventually make it to the top.
Yeah. Well, the cursus honorum and the legati and all that sort of thing. That you get that training and you learn your role. Because there's a again with Marius, there's a Sulla serves as Marius's praetor in the Jugurthan War, and claims credit for it, which survives in Sallust. But one of the points is that there is no way a praetor would have claimed responsibility for the victory at the time, because you're not going to cross your senior politician, you're not going to cross your commander, the consul, because he was the serving consul, and that must be a later claim that survives from his version of events.
I mean, there is a story given out by Plutarch on that one, of course, that Sulla very soon after, so that he's not going outwardly against his own commander, but surreptitiously doing it, he changes his signet ring at that time to show his achievement, so that he can actually spread word amongst his intimates.
Yeah, and again, it's what Marius did with Metellus. You know, I can win this war. Give me command. You know, you've actually just stabbed your commander in the back, not literally, as that comes later in politics, but you know, that competitive nature of Roman politics and Roman command, that you know, these egotistical Roman, not mafia bosses, but you know, they are powerful men who want the opportunity to prove themselves for the state and for themselves.
It's the natural development, is it not, when you encourage everybody to be demonstrators and exemplars of virtus, so you're going to be courageous, which in a sense is almost reckless. I mean, you know, you put yourself in the greatest danger and then you get the greatest honor, that is the greatest display of courage. So that by definition encourages everybody to be competitive.
In the later Roman armies, at least, centurions have a very high death rate because they're all stationed in the front rank on the basis that they have to lead by example, and then a lot of them get slain in combat.
Well, you also have to create new positions to cycle through and raise other people, so it's actually quite a good idea.
Not if you're a centurion, I think.
Not if you're a junior centurion.
No, yeah, it's sort of what this system stimulates. You know, this you have to be brave. You have to go out there. I mean, if we believe Julius Caesar's own accounts, then he also he had his red cape on and he ran into battle to give a good example to his men. Of course, it's Julius Caesar himself saying that, like you pointed out. But that's sort of the idea of leading by example that gets people killed. And it's not just the Romans; it's the Greeks also. If you look at Epaminondas, for example, brilliant tactician, brilliant leader who gets killed in combat because he's right there in the front rank.
But this is a society that doesn't really care about the fact that you die. It cares very much about how you die. Mm-hmm. And you've got to do it for your country. And it's for us in the 21st century, it's sort of slightly alien because one, we're afraid of death and we don't talk about it like the ancient people did. But the second thing is we don't glorify it in the way we do. Or they did. And I think, for example, you look at the coinage. I mean, their coinage is littered with images of written down barbarians and spear wielding. I mean, it's a festival of death and killing, which is enshrined as emblems of what the state is about. So the res publica is a nasty machine if you're an enemy of it, and a glorious one if you work for it.
It extends to the tomb decoration as well. That's, again, whether you die in battle gloriously, that's another tomb motif that comes up, you know, very frequently.
It has everything to do with the conception of the afterlife, of course, in that in our world with Judean Christian influences, there you are rewarded after death. Whereas in ancient Greece and Rome, when you die, you just sort of float around on the fields of asphodel. If you want to become immortal, you have to make a name for yourself during your life, and one of the ways to do that is to die heroically in battle.
In fact, those are the sorts of ways that we think of Vikings, and in fact what they have is more typical of the ancient world in general.
To die with a sword in your hand, yes.
Mm-hmm. Exactly, or on your feet, or something. I mean, you've got to die like a man does. And it's interesting to me, I mean, I live in a country where the military is looked at differently than, for example, where I come from. And there's a profound national regard and respect for soldiers. I mean, support our troops is the sort of thing people have done for snippets for. And you don't necessarily get that feel with Roman people because they are the soldiers. I mean, we don't need to support them. We are the soldiers. We go out and do the job ourselves.
Yeah, it's one of the things that makes it a little bit different with regard to the ancient world. Also because there's a much closer tie between politics, between society and politics and the military, which we don't really have. Everything is very segregated nowadays. So you have the politicians at the top, you have society as a whole, and then you have the army sort of somewhere that we try to keep away from the rest of society, and that's completely alien to the ancient world, basically.
Well, ironically, what the parallel is, in a sense, if you look at this country, where you've got professional army and all the military services, and like you rightly say, Josho, the way that you segregated the political system, but the Roman system is completely different. To get into the public political system, you have to have taken part in the army. And the further up you go, of course, the more commands you get and the more seniority and so on. So you get the sense that when you declare war on an enemy, you know what that means. You know what the real cost and the risks of that are. In a way that I think politicians in the modern era are very quick to say, hey, we'll send an army. because it's really far away and we don't have to worry about these things, whereas they're putting their suns in firing line.
This is a question sent in via email by Alex from Scotland, who says he's a big fan of the podcast, and he's always wondered how long a warrior, such as a Roman legionary, was likely to survive in a pitched battle. If he was in the front row, was he almost guaranteed to die? Or if he was skilled, was he more likely to survive? And how much skill and luck came into it? And if a battle were to last up to a few hours or even half a day, how did they refresh the front line without breaking the shield wall? And he then refers to movies where if a warrior falls, a soldier falls, he is replaced by somebody in the line behind him. And also reference to the TV show Rome, where a centurion blows a whistle and then the front row steps back and the second row steps forward to replace him. And he asked if there was such a system of rotation in place.
I think the simple answer, Josho, is we don't know. Being a member of the Industry Guard, or at least a veteran of it, there's just not enough information to be able to know the practicalities to that level of detail. There are things that make sense to do, that you would rotate people out, but we don't know the practicality. There have been experiments to try and test out how that would work in practice. I certainly know from having worn the Lorica segmentata for a whole day, standing around in it gets tiring. And when you do a little display of about 20 minutes and holding the shield is several kilos of weight. That gets tiring, and in fact, if you're then in the phase of pushing and shoving and doing other things with that, it does get tiring, and you don't really last that long. So that does infer that you'd be rotating people out. But how you do it, I don't know. Whether they were using whistles, I'm told that whistles are actually quite commonly found in archaeology. Does that mean they were used in the army for that? That's in that scene in Rome. I don't know, because you can't necessarily connect those events up. In terms of things like the propensity to die if you're in the front row, again, I think it's very, very hard. I don't think you can work those things out from the evidence. The tombstones give you a smattering of ages of people dying and ranks and so on, and they don't necessarily tell you how they died. Some may tell you they died in a battle, but it's hard to, or like the Bello Veriano, for example, or there's one in Carlion in South Wales which talks about the German War, which is apparently under, I think, Caracalla. But can you tie that down to a particular death event? You probably can't. So I suppose your guess is as good as ours.
Well, it's a topic of some debate, because we have descriptions, of course, of battles where they say they last hours or even an entire day. And then we do have this problem of how did they fight in that particular case. If they were in formation, you cannot fight for hours, because in the end you will succumb. So there's always this tension between our idea, or a common idea at least, of Romans in this case fighting in close formation, and then the difficulty of actually physically being able to maintain your position in line, which suggests that if those battles indeed lasted for hours or an entire day, that the formation was probably a lot more fluid and open than is generally considered, where it was possible for men in the front line at some point to say, you know what, I'm going to fall back for a moment, catch my breath, and you carry on the fighting for me.
Well, the Optio famously had a very long start with the knob at the end, and the intention of the Optio was apparently to run up and down the line and actually bash people in the back, and anybody who gave us hint that he was going to do a runner. I guess that's a reasonable thing to do, so that does suggest that there was fear in the ranks. And someone earlier said about the fact that the death rates of centurions was increasingly high because they were in the front line, so I suppose that would be an obvious thing. I guess the other thing it comes down to, we tend to think of the deployment of a legion, certainly of the early empire, in terms of its cohorts. And there's a whole debate on, who's in fact in command of a cohort, did the cohort have its insignia, and so on and so forth. The reality is probably that the century is the fighting unit. And you may be able to revolve a century, and depending if you make them into small wedges of, bearing in mind you're dealing with 80 men, you could have wedge formations in 2 lines of 20, or you could have them in different numbers and multiples, and you could rotate those units and pull them back. But it takes some doing. In a melee, amongst the din and the noise and the groaning, you're trying to get people to do what are choreographed movements. And I guess through training, and that's what it comes down to, the training and the discipline, and reliance on the unit commander, in this case the centurion and his principality, his immediate group of officers, and the Korniken and the standard, they're all working as a tight unit. you can probably do some very good things, like a platoon can in a modern.
It all depends also on what you're interpreting as the battle. I mean, in some of the going back to the sort of early Republican era, in some of the accounts, we sort of don't really understand, I think, whether what they refer to as the battle, when they're saying it goes on for half a day, is that all the skirmishes that go on beforehand, before they actually maybe even the main armies are actually in place. What are we actually including in the term battle?
Well, I suppose the analogy would be something like the Battle of Waterloo. I mean, the Battle of Waterloo raged, wouldn't it, for a whole day? And it starts off on a farm over here and a field over there and a square formation. And the totality of it makes the Battle of Waterloo. Now, if you're an individual participant in the Battle of Waterloo, it looks very different depending on where you stand. And I'm going to guess that in Roman battle, if you were in Caesar's army, it would look different, depending on where you were. And I think it's true also, if you look at something like Mons Graupius, a lot of people standing around like spectators, or just watching a few people engaged in warfare. Mons Graupius famously did Iliad, and most of the fighting, and the legionaries just stand and watch. And the research I did into the battle of things like Angevarian War, the legion would get used. But for example, in Battle of Weser River, and I forget the other one that goes with that, Diviso, for example, again, the legionaries play pretty much a stand around and watch role while the cavalry actually engage.
I get the sense in, like, looking at some of the Hellenistic battles as well, say the battles involving Eumenes, etc., that there is a lot of posturing going on before the battles as well. I mean, lining up of the elephants. I mean, I can't remember which battle it is involving. I think it's one of the ones with Eumenes and Antigonus, where they take half a day in terms of actually moving their cavalry and their elephants, and before actually engaging in the second half of the day.
I think that there must have been a system of rotation. Otherwise, 3 lines, and why would you have a rank 8 men deep in a hoplite formation unless you could rotate? It's not all about the weight of the charge. That's another debate. I think there must have been a system. We don't know how it worked or what it was. I think in the confusion of battle, it's not this rigid line. There's obviously going to be give and take. There's going to be opportunities where gaps occur that you can rotate out. Obviously, if someone falls, you're going to be able to step into that gap. I think also there's no other rank to die in. If you're going to die in that warfare, it's going to be in the front rank. You'd be very unlucky unless it's through archery to fall or missile to fall out behind the first rank or two. And I think that the idea of skill is that fighting in a formation, the skill of fighting in a formation is different to being an amazing duelist, for instance. That what's required in a shield wall is tight efficiency, and the development of Roman weaponry is designed to enhance that efficiency, as opposed to a long sword, which is an encumbrance in a shield wall formation. So there are skills, but I think they're specific skill sets to legionary tactics, and we know from the drill that there is certain things that they concentrate on doing to minimise the risk to them. And again, getting back to that Rome series, the idea that we have of some bloodlust Roman running forward to take out the enemy by himself in a heroic kind of way. In the Rome series, he's pulled back into line, and sort of dressed down for endangering his comrades. So I think there are specific skill sets to legionary combat, which are not necessarily you are the best fighter one-on-one. So yes, there's a rotation system. We don't know what it was. Yes, you die in the front rank and are very unlucky to die anywhere else. And yes, there's a skill set. There you go.
He has a related question to that, which I think is also difficult to answer in this particular case, since we have only anecdotal information. But it's again related to movies. We see the hero or heroine killing off multiple less well-trained opponents. Is there any evidence of skilled soldiers killing multiple opponents in a battle or skirmish? Or was it more or less a case of a soldier killing one, maybe two of the enemy before he himself was killed, or probably wounded, or had to be taken out of rotation, or whatever? And his question is, would a veteran of 20 years have been in, say, 8 battles and killed 2 or 3 people in each? So it's more or less a related question. I think it's very difficult to answer in a particular case whether the death rate of people taking part in ancient battles and basically the kill ratio of the average warrior.
The filmic depictions obviously can never get shield warfare right, because it always deteriorates into a melee of one man against one man. And in a way, they're very boring. Shield walls clashing and pushing against one another isn't filmic. Just the same as all Roman combat involves explosions. There's always flame in Roman combat from Spartacus onwards. And Gladiator had it, and every depiction of Roman warfare has some. Roman and ancient warfare would have been reasonably silent. Yes, there would be screaming, but not. What's to blow up? What's it's kind of metal clanking against metal and the screams of the wounded and the dying. But from our modern and filmic depiction, no soundtrack or anything. It would be a very quiet war.
I'm not sure if it was so quiet because of all the clank of the metal and also the amount of noise that a group of people makes, and especially if you have thousands of people yelling, talking, whispering, shoveling their armor around, adjusting their shields, all the dust that appears as they walk. It's probably.
Don't forget the cacophony of each of the centuries actually blowing out orders on the horns.
Also, yeah.
True. I don't mean silent. I mean, on top of all of that, which
right.
you get in modern warfare too, but then you also have explosions and gunfire.
Depends if you're talking about siege warfare as well.
The contribution I would make to this particular point, I think, is there's a dramatic scene in Tacitus where he talks about Germanicus going into one of the camps in Germany, Romagna, Inferior, I think it is, when he's not greeted, effectively. He's rather badly disrespected by the mutineers in AD 14 in the summer. And this ragtag bunch of people with broken teeth and looking like a really motley crew, who said that we've served like 30 years and our papers told us we were going to retire 5 years ago and I want to be paid and all that kind of stuff. You get the sense that the warfare was brutal. People did sustain injuries. I mean, we know that they had hospitals. We know from Celsus that they had a good extensive knowledge of wounds and treatment of wounds, particularly those to do with projectiles and cuts and slashes. So, and fixing bones and all this kind of stuff. And so it does tell you that the whole brutal scenario means that it's not a place you want to be.
But I mean, there's the picture of Scaevus in the Civil Wars that he absolutely sort of stands there and kills multiple opponents. He stomps on his own eye at one point. And there are images of that, but I don't know that it's emphasized. But I think that the veterans of multiple battles will have killed multiple opponents. If it is a 2-hour battle and you are in the front rank, you are going to be killing multiple opponents. And if the luck factor comes in that you survive, then you will have done that. But there's been some studies in post-traumatic stress in the ancient world that it's not something that people talk about. I've killed this many opponents. You do get it in gladiatorial combat, but no, we don't have anyone telling us that your average kill rate for your legionary per battle is X.
Bearing in mind what we were saying earlier about the competitive nature of the society, and even as it expanded, I mean, Roman cultural values are going out. People are rewarded with all sorts of medallions and all sorts of emblemata of bravery, for being the first over a wall, and for saving a comrade, and all sorts of things. And centurions particularly could wear them on a harness, the phalera, all this sort of wonderful stuff. There is a reward culture there for glory, in the colonies, there would have been people in the bars as retirees talking about those things. Oh, I killed 5. Oh, I killed 16. Oh, dear.
Yeah.
And I've got cuts to prove it. There, look, and there.
Yeah, it may not have been considered appropriate in other contexts, maybe.
Well, in other cultures, in our culture, absolutely no. That's not the sort of thing we celebrate. But as I keep coming back to the coinage expresses some of the virtues of a society. Ours is all about flowers and regents and presidents and all sorts of specific things. I mean, things that exude confidence and strength in ways that don't threat. Ancient coinage, certainly the Roman Republic, in the later part not so much, but of the Empire, you go all the way through Trajan. There's a whole series of Dacian war coins. I mean, or the famous Judaea Capta, the one from Vespasian and Titus, and all the coins in between there. It's a celebration of brutality and capture and war and so on. And what it says is, we are the victors, and we are the ones who are, led by heavens, as it were, and the other people are our subjects. And it's a very alien way to look at the world for our eyes, but it was absolutely the way they looked at it.
There's also the non-Roman aspect of it as well. I mean, the allies that are brought in to serve in the Roman army. I mean, you've got Gauls who are... They tend to actually go home with the heads of heads of prisoners lashed to the side of their horses, and that's expressed in outrage by some of the Roman authors about we're employing these barbarians, but that's got to play into also the cultural view of warfare that we're employing them. They're part of our army. They're part of the us factor. So.
Yeah. The Romans are very good at hypocrisy too. I mean, it was great. They have gladiators on the one hand, but they, they carry heads around. My God, what people are these?
Yeah. Mind you, the Egyptian cutting hands off to prove how many men you killed. That whole here's my head count.
Hands are the polite version, even.
True.
I think this is a good point as any to bring the discussion to a close. I'd like to thank Lindsay, Murray, and Mark for their participation, and also my thanks to Angus, who has the unenviable task of editing this episode together, which took quite longer than normal, I think. So that's all. I would say good night from me and good night from the panel.